Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 18th meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome members, welcome our witnesses, welcome visitors to the public gallery. Can I remind everyone present, please, either to turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electronic devices. Right, item 1 on the agenda is continuation of our scrutiny at stage 1 of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. We have one panel of witnesses this morning, and I'd like to welcome, starting on my left, Andrew Fraser, who's Head of Democratic and Administration Services, North Ayrshire Council. We have Councillor Michael Cook, who is the Vice President of COSLA, Jim Galloway, who's Service Manager, Economic Development at City of Edinburgh Council, and David Cooper, Environmental Health Manager, Infrastructure Services at Aberdeenshire Council. Thank you all, gentlemen, for coming along. I think before we get into questions, Councillor Cook, you wanted to say something briefly by way of an introduction.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I don't have a pre-prepared statement, but obviously I'm the one politician on the panel of 4 that you have, so perhaps it falls to me to say something first. As far as COSLA is concerned, I think it's perhaps worth focusing on the 3 items that we've highlighted in our submission, which really are national standards, the economic duty, and the planning penalty clause. I think it's fair to say that in relation to the first of those 2 items, while they started in a place that I think raised some difficulties for local government in terms of cutting across local democratic accountability, perhaps complicating existing duties that we already had, there has been some movement on those propositions, and I think we're more comfortable with where we've got to on those points. In terms of the third proposition, the penalty clause in respect of planning matters, there is still, I think, some significant difference between ourselves and government in relation to the utility of that and the wisdom of such a proposition, where actually we all have the same objective, which is to ensure that we get quality planning decisions in the quickest possible time. So there is still some difference on that. I know you will want to ask questions about all of these areas, and I know that together with colleagues here, we're very happy to answer those.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. Now, we've got quite a broad range of issues we want to cover this morning. You'll be familiar with the bill. Is quite wide-ranging. Some of the issues you've touched on, the issue of national standards being applied, I know that's of interest to members. I think the interest of the new duty to promote sustainable economic growth, I think that will be of interest to members. Some of the issues around the code of practice, the planning matter you've touched on, street traders' licences, and I'd also like to pick up later the question of primary authority partnerships, which I know doesn't feature in the bill at the moment, but there is some pressure for that to be brought in. I've said to members, if we can keep our questions as ever short and to the point, and it would be very helpful if the answers could similarly be short and to the point insofar as that's possible. I've also said to members if we can direct our questions, if we can, at an individual on the panel, because if all 4 of you try and answer every single question, we'll quickly find out the time will get away from us. So if members could direct their questions at a particular individual, I think, Councillor Cook, in many cases, I think you might find yourself first in the firing line, but don't feel embarrassed by that in any way. That's what you're here for. But then if others on the panel want to come in and respond to a question directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, and I'll bring you in if I can. I wonder if I could maybe just start off by asking a little bit about the memorandum of understanding that's been signed between the Scottish Government and COSLA in relation to the exercise of regulatory functions and future national standards. I see from that the Scottish Government are proposing to fund a policy manager post in COSLA to assist with delivering the new system. I take it that's now in place, Councillor Cook?
It is in place.
Thank you very much. Yes. It's very helpful to members of the gallery volunteering information, probably not strictly within standing orders, but good to know that position that person's in place. Thank you for that. Within the memorandum of understanding, I see that there are provisions for the Minister to discuss with the relevant COSLA spokesperson where there are to be issues around local variation or issues around nationally set fees or charging regimes. Councillor Cook, are you able to tell us how in practice you think that's going to work? Because it just occurs to me that the COSLA spokesperson will be an elected councillor from a particular local authority. How are they going to make sure that any decisions they have with the minister properly reflect the views of council groups across Scotland rather than just their own particular interest?
Well, I think we've got to start at the beginning, which was that the first iteration of the bill obviously had fairly significant and sweeping powers set out which ministers could utilise on as yet undefined legislation on undefined areas of activity. So what there has been since then is a quite considerable discussion between Scottish Government and local government about that approach. So where we've got to, I think, is a compromise. Is it the ideal position? I think we would say it's certainly a much better position than we began with. I don't think I would characterise it as the ideal position, but I think we've got to proceed on the basis of what seems to me to be a reasonable compromise, which is that Scottish Government have moved some way and we have moved some way to finding actually the areas which are relevant here. National standards. If you're talking about national service where you expect a consistency of provision right across the board, then it's absolutely right. I think we would all expect the same consistency of provision. But there are many areas of local government service provision. Our council provides 600 areas of service provision or so where you would expect some local variation. What we do in Scottish Borders is different from what they do in Aberdeenshire or what they do in the City of Edinburgh. That's a reflection of democratic local accountability, and it's appropriate that locally democratic politicians are involved in the decision-making around that. In terms of how the COSLA spokesperson negotiates and relates to the minister, clearly we have a structure within COSLA. We have a leadership group within COSLA. The spokesperson is, to use a phrase that you used earlier, in the firing line in terms of the relationship in respect of the particular area of activity they represent when it comes to negotiating and dealing with government. Now, I think we've got to make certain assumptions about the intent of government in committing to that memorandum of understanding. It's pretty clear, actually, that the intent is that there should be a collaborative approach, that there should be a genuine effort to find out what is fit for purpose in particular areas of activity. So, for example, if you take something like alcohol licensing, it may be that you want to use a different yardstick in certain parts of the country from other parts of the country. Another example would be knife dealers licensing. There may be a different approach in the City of Glasgow to that used in Highland. That's entirely right. There are probably fewer shops selling ski and doos in Glasgow than there are in Highland. So we need to have an approach which reflects local circumstances and actually reflects an understanding of what the issues are on the ground, and that is something that local government can bring in a discussion with central government.
And you're confident that the COSLA spokesperson, even though they may not come from an authority that's actually seeking a local variation, they'll be properly able to represent that view to Scottish Government? Oh,
I'm in no doubt about that. It's part of your obligation, I think, if you're an office holder within COSLA, that you need to sink any particular political feeling that you may have, because you've got a wider responsibility, and your responsibility is to represent local government as a whole. So I don't have an anxiety about that.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think we want to go on to the subject of national standards and how that's going to operate in practice. I'll bring in Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Can I maybe first ask you about evidence we heard last week about this operating on a voluntary basis? The regulatory review group had said they'd put some processes in place that had been followed through on a voluntary basis. And I wondered whether you thought, if that had been so successful, whether or not we need legislation to make this happen in the future.
I take it that's directed to me.
Sorry.
Yes. I mean, I think really, as I was setting out at the beginning, probably the attitude of local government is to have legislation set around trying to reserve powers to ministers to deal with undefined propositions as yet is not the ideal way to proceed in this area. But it's clear that Scottish ministers want to achieve levels of consistency of approach in areas that they feel are appropriate. Where they've moved in respect of this is a willingness, I think, to discuss on a much more collaborative basis with local government where those areas should be. Now, I think, again, in my earlier answer, what I was saying is it's a question of horses for courses. There may be some things where it is appropriate that actually legislation is brought forward and that you have some kind of setting of national standards by consequence of legislation. It may be that other areas of activity should be dealt with by simple protocols and a general form of guidance. It really depends upon the issue, and I think that is appropriate. In a way, this, I suppose, is our anxiety about the whole proposition to begin with, is if you reserve generalised powers, you're implying that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, which simply isn't the reality. I've already referred to the fact that we as a council provide over 600 services. That's true of every council in the land. To imagine that you can set general propositions which will control all of that activity from the centre is misconceived in my view. It also ignores a very real reality which sometimes we're too quick to ignore, is actually councils are locally democratically accountable bodies. The politicians on there have a responsibility and an accountability to the constituencies they represent in the particular areas that they're from. So it's important that that has a currency here as well. And I think to set generalised powers sometimes ignores that reality.
Does the bill then sufficiently deal with that aspect of local democracy? Does it take into account local circumstances? Is there enough flexibility within it to allow councillors to exercise local democracy and reflect local circumstances?
I think we're heading down the same path, really, that I've already hinted at, is would we regard it as an ideal that there are these generalised powers? No, I think is the answer to that. Are we satisfied that the effort to create a memorandum of understanding and certain balances and controls within the system is an appropriate way to proceed in the light of government's determination to have generalised power? We're in a better place. There's no two ways about it. I mean, I'm sure that we'll move on to the economic duty, but economic duty is a good example of the kind of issue here. Now, I would say to you quite simply that no one in any council in this land is under any misapprehension about the importance of sustainable economic growth. There's no ambiguity about that at all. But to create a situation in which you make things subservient to that duty so that you potentially subvert equally important balancing considerations, whether they're social or environmental, is misconceived. Now, again, on that, ministers have shown a willingness to move. So, while I have no doubt that Andrew will comment on some of the legalistic aspects of the economic duty, nonetheless, there has been movement from ministers, and I think we've got to a better place on that proposition as well, which suggests compromise and would allow councils to take into account other responsibilities that they have, such as community empowerment, best value, and so forth. That's important. Those responsibilities already exist on us. Some are the creatures of statute. To simply supervene that with another legislative responsibility sometimes causes noise in the system and simply confuses the issues. And as I say, the fundamental reality is none of us are under any illusions about the importance of economic growth.
We're going to come on specifically and address that issue in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just based on what you've said, you've said that you think legislation is the right way forward. But I'm also picking up from you a bit of concern about local democracy, local circumstances and the like. What would you have preferred to see then? You know, what's missing or what shouldn't be there?
Actually, I don't think I did say that legislation was necessarily the right way to proceed. What I'm saying to you, I think, is the legislation which has generalised powers at the heart of it is frankly not the right way to proceed. By consequence of that, the implication is, and this is my view, is that the appropriate way to proceed is horses for courses. Actually, you have a look at the area of activity and then you create appropriate legislative duties or regulatory guidance dependent on what the area of concern is. That's how you should deal with matters. It always, you know, I'm an ex-lawyer, it depends upon the evidence. You should look at the evidence and then draw up your legislative propositions in the light of that evidence. Unfortunately, this doesn't quite do that, even though there have been efforts to mitigate some of the more sweeping propositions within the bill.
So what you're saying is this legislation is not required. However, further legislation on more focused areas would be required. Is that? I'm just not entirely clear what you think should be instead.
Well, what you're doing is very gently putting words in my mouth there.
I'm trying not to.
Yeah, it's which is entirely fair, and you'll appreciate that I'm trying to give a compromise response to you, because actually that's the attitude of local government. The attitude of local government is the legislation generally, or a general proposition in legislation, is not the ideal way forward, but we have negotiated a more moderate approach with which we're satisfied. I think that's it in a nutshell. This is okay.
Mr. Fraser, I think, wants to come in.
Thanks. I think it would be unusual that legislation required a non-statutory memorandum of understanding to make it acceptable and workable. And I think that really emphasises the really wide sweeping powers that ministers would take in sections 1 to 3, really to amend pretty much any regulatory regime, without, in my view, a real justification as why that's needed. And effectively, to a certain extent, it's bypassing Parliament. I think the other thing is there's been a bit of mixed messages. First of all, the consultation was about national standards, and I think the thought was we were talking about high-level stuff, you know, national planning framework and things like that. Now we're talking about inconsistencies, about which might be low-level. There's not really a complete justification of why this is needed. I know we have some low-level examples, such as the issue with food certificates, but these sort of things come out of bad drafting or lack of consultation in the drafting. I don't think there's a rationale for ministers to take huge powers over the regulatory regime, essentially bypassing Parliament.
Still is slightly at a loss as to what your overall view on the bill is. I'm getting that, I mean, it's okay. Now that we've had some compromises, it's fine. You know, is there something that you would prefer in its place? I mean,
I'm perfectly happy to have another go, Chairman. Clearly, I've got to give a nuanced response which embodies the whole of local government, which I'm here to represent. Now, Andrew, I think, has hinted at the reality is, in terms of the generalised power in relation to national standards, that's not something that we would wish to see ideally. That's the starting off point. However, we accept that there has been a discussion with Scottish Government which has got this to a better place, not an ideal place. I wouldn't pretend for a moment the local government is ecstatic with this result, but we've got to a better place in terms of what we think the legislation now says. And that's because the more sweeping aspect of the legislation, perhaps unusually, as Andrew says, has to some extent been mitigated by a memorandum of understanding. We believe that that will be, or the spirit of that will be accepted by ministers, and on that basis of goodwill, quite frankly, we're happy to proceed as things are set out. Is this the ideal? The answer to your question is no, it's not, as far as we're concerned.
I suppose, from our point of view, our job is to make it ideal. That's what committee scrutiny is about. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to get out of you is what needs to change to make it ideal.
Well, I mean, the implication of that is you would remove the generalised duty, and what you would have is an expectation that Scottish Government brought forward appropriate legislation or appropriate guidance, protocols, whatever, in relation to discrete areas. That would be the implication of that.
Mackenzie.
Thank you, Convener. This discussion, my question is really for Councillor Cook. because well, I didn't expect you to be surprised, but this discussion so far and the written submission seems to be quite theoretical. And I think we all understand the theory of local democratic accountability and, you know, decisions being taken at a local level. That sounds, you know, very nice. What I'm struggling to come up with are practical examples which illustrate that theory. So perhaps you can provide the committee with 2, maybe 3 practical examples of where a community have campaigned. Let's imagine the community of Tyree. So, maybe just stop while you have your conversation.
Sorry, we're checking examples. We will give you examples.
Right. Let's imagine the community of Tyree or North Ronaldsay coming together to lobby their local authority and say, we don't like the way you're applying this regulation. We feel it's inappropriate for Tyree or North Ronaldsay, and where local authorities have responded to that and modified the way they apply regulations. And I'm really struggling to come up with practical, concrete examples of where local authorities have responded in that way. And if I understand correctly, that seems to be the gist of the theoretical argument that's been put. Could you give me maybe three examples?
Okay. Well, I'll give you a generalised understanding of what the reality is first, then I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll ask Andrew to give you an example as well. In terms of the reality, you give an example of Tyree and North Ronaldsay and issues that they might have. Let's think about what the issues are that they might have in relation to regulation and the propositions laid out in the bill. Let's say that communities there are subjected to an application for a significant wind farm. Now, it matters to them how the council deals with that application. It matters in terms of the timescales that they apply to consideration of that application.
Can I just stop you there, please? Can I just stop you there? I'm sure we'll come on to talk about planning later on, but there's nothing in this bill that suggests a modification to planning other than the fee regime.
I'm sorry, you're wrong. The economic duty potentially has an implication in relation to planning. So, you know, we need to appreciate that if you create generalised duties, that they may have implications for later on.
Okay.
Now, that is one example. Clearly there is an importance here for people on the ground that we balance in a proportionate way considerations which are important to communities. And, you know, I would say to you quite candidly, the people who are best at doing that are those who are closest. That's the underlying principle of, I see a shake of a head there, but that is the principle of subsidiarity. The people at the lowest level who are most proximate to the decisions to be made are usually best at doing that. In terms of other examples, I did give you a couple of examples already. Alcohol licensing would be one. There may be particular issues.
But please forgive me, that's not a specific example. Can you give me a specific example of where a community have lobbied their local authority and asked for regulations to be applied in a different way that reflects the circumstances of that community? Now, to merely generalise that and talk about licensing in general terms does not give that concrete example.
Yeah, well, allow me to, well, let's give you a specific example. The question of alcohol licensing is currently highly relevant in the area that I'm from, the Borders. Now, this is a slightly different take on it, but we are the only local authority area in Scotland that doesn't have alcohol bylaws in urban settlements at the present time. So there's an active discussion with communities about whether that is some kind of regulation that they would wish to have. The view of the community or the largest community in my area is that is something that they would wish to have. That is not necessarily the view throughout the region. Certainly other towns, I'm aware, have a slightly different view. It's entirely appropriate that we find out what the views are of people on the ground, and then we make judgments about that, and that's actually what we'll seek to do. you've got an example, Andrew. I think Andrew has a further example.
Yeah, I can maybe perhaps use the example of liquor licensing again. Liquor licensing is now a system driven by policy. Every 3 years a licensing policy statement is prepared. What you do is you map the figures for the impact of alcohol on health, crime, disorder, fires, etc. For example, my former authority, Western Bartonshire, figures were coming out at 6% of the population addicted to alcohol, 2% addicted to drugs, 4 to 5 people directly impacted by every addiction. So you're looking at 30 to 40% of the population directly impacted by alcohol and drugs addiction. That excludes loads of the other alcohol impacts. Clearly a major impact on Western Bartonshire, similar to many authorities in the west of Scotland. That authority decided to take an over-provision policy that in 15 out of 18 areas of the council there would be no more licensed premises. Now, clearly in areas, Morningside, whatever, entirely different needs. So what you've ended up there across Scotland is essentially a postcode lottery, inconsistent policy. If you want a licence in Western Bartonshire, there's a presumption you won't get it. If you want a licence in Eastern Bartonshire, you're highly likely to get it. But it's targeted at local needs and local requirements. And it's really this whole sense of looking at place, which feeds into the whole community planning agenda just now, that the resources of community partners should be targeted together to meet the big problems in a society. So having one consistent regulatory regime across Scotland doesn't do that.
Thank you.
If I may just pursue this. We've just heard about the issue about communities, you listen to communities, but at the end of the day, the councils apply a general rule as to how individual councils will arrive at a decision which applies across the council.
Necessarily.
Right. Are you telling me in the borders that there have been situations where communities have either been for wind farms or against, and the council has gone along with the wishes of the community?
Oh, that's a completely different proposition.
No, it's not a different proposition.
I'm sorry, it is a different proposition.
Well, with all due respect, it is not.
Well, no, it is, because that's a regulatory function, and clearly the planning committee needs to make a judgment based on the merit or the adverse effects of that application.
So the national government should do the same in terms of applicable regulations across all councils.
Sorry, you'll have to clarify what you mean.
You're saying the local authority, it's all right for the regulation of the guidance to be set there for communities, but it's not okay for the national government to set the applicable.
Sorry, I think you misunderstand. No one's saying that.
Perhaps it wasn't clear.
Well, I think it was clear. No one is saying the national guidance is inappropriate here. What I think we're saying very clearly is there are circumstances where national guidance is appropriate. That should be a matter of discussion, evidence, forethought, planning. The more general proposition...
And isn't that what we're doing today?
Well, the question is whether you take the view that generalised powers in terms of national guidance are prudent, or whether you take a view that actually it's better to look at the evidence in relation to discrete areas and then make a judgment. Personally, I would tend to the latter, but I appreciate that others may tend to the former.
But communities might say the same thing with vis-à-vis local authorities. I'll pass on.
Okay. One other question I've got on this application of national standards, unless other members want to come in on this subject area. The financial memorandum of the bill says that local authorities will experience no net impact on costs in relation to Part 1 of the bill. Is that something you agree with?
I'll pick that up. It's difficult to be certain at this point in time, I think, is the answer to that, because we don't know how the standards are going to be applied or what areas they're going to apply to. Clearly, the expectation around the memorandum that's been created is there would be a discussion with Scottish Government about any anticipated cost impacts as a result of something that they wanted to bring forward.
Okay. Right, thank you. I want to move on and talk about this issue of opting in or opting out from national standards at a local level. I think Rhoda Grant's got a question on that.
Yes. And it follows on from previous questioning, really. Should councils and indeed bodies covered by the bill be able to opt in or opt out of the various regulations that are put forward under the bill?
Again, I think it's quite difficult to give a straightforward answer to that. I really think it depends upon the circumstances. And it just goes back, I think, to the original proposition that if you set national guidance, you're setting out a proposition that generally a minister can come along and set a series of propositions. It's far better that we look at the individual area and then make judgments about it. And there will be, inevitably, there are differences between communities. There's now a significant emphasis on place in terms of policy determination. Community planning is a fundamental principle of the government's public reform agenda. All of that, I think, is right. But part of the implication of that is that you have a look at the circumstances on the ground and you make judgments about that. So the tool for doing that really is single outcome agreements and, for example, pursuing, whether it's economic growth or whether it's pursuing health outcomes or whatever it might be, using the tool of single outcome agreements, which again are agreed with local partners but also sanctioned by government. That's how we should proceed to deal with those issues.
This is, I think, going back to your answer to the last question,
Yeah.
where you felt that there shouldn't be an overall duty at all within the bill, that each thing should be legislated on its own behalf. However, if we had an overall duty, I mean, should individual pieces of regulation have an opt-in, that councils can choose to opt into that, or indeed some criteria to allow them to opt out of it, taking into account, for example, local circumstances? Would that help to make the bill more workable for you?
Potentially. I mean, I would be completely candid with you. I'm finding it difficult to think of an example of that, but it really depends on the issue, I think. You would need to have a particular issue, look at what that area of activity was to make a judgment about whether you really do need to have a national standard without any opt-out, or whether you have something that is sufficiently flexible to allow councils or communities to opt out. And it may be that in certain circumstances, some form of opt-out would be appropriate. That would seem to me to be an appropriate approach.
You talked about outcome agreements and the like as maybe the basis for opt-outs, you know, if you were looking at how you were delivering services. I mean, outcome agreements is maybe one criteria for an opt-out. Should there be other criteria? Because obviously if you're going to legislate, you don't want everyone just to opt out or opt in as they see fit. You want something that you know, stands up to scrutiny, that people can opt out for a reason. What would the reasons be in your mind?
I think it's evidence, essentially. One of the founding propositions in respect of single outcome agreements is that local communities should know thyself, if you like, to use a kind of biblical expression, but they should know what the evidence is in their area, whether it's in relation to health issues, whether it's in relation to demography, whether it's in relation to educational attainment. They should have an understanding of all those things. Now, it seemed to me to be right that when you have a look at a particular area, that there is some judgment based on what that evidence tells you, and an opt-out may flow from that kind of judgment. It seems to me that would be an appropriate way to proceed.
I mean, our duty as a committee is to scrutinise and amend the legislation as required. You know, frankly, that sounds fine, but it's a bit woolly to legislate on. You know, how would you legislate to allow an opt-out that we could write into the bill that would say this is the criteria for the opt-out, this is what you have to match or equal or have concerns about, that would allow you then to go back to the government and say we wish to opt out of this legislation?
Well, it's inevitably a bit woolly because you're asking me to speculate on things which, you know, I'm sorry, I'm just not capable of speculating on those things. There are things out there which I won't know, where you would have a level of different circumstances which suggest that you should have different approaches in different communities. Now, I can't see what those are. What I would suggest to you, I mean, we'd be happy to have a further thought about that and have a look to see whether we can provide you with further written evidence which gives you a flavour of things where an opt-out may be appropriate. I think it would be fair for us to do that, but it's in a way, you're quite justifiably, but you're asking me to look into a crystal ball, and you know, among my attributes, that unfortunately isn't one of my greatest skills. But so I would find it difficult to imagine what those scenarios are. We can have a think about it in the office, and we can try and give you something additional in relation to that.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, just looking at the consultation, there was 2/3 of the local authorities who responded to the consultation said that they should have the right to opt out on grounds of exceptional local circumstances. I think you said a moment ago, you know, you saw opt-outs in certain circumstances. I mean, leaving aside this question of examples, who should decide that? Who should decide whether a local authority should get an opt-out?
The implication of the memorandum is that it would be a matter of discussion between local government and central government, and I think that would probably be appropriate.
But ultimately, it'd have to be Scottish Government would make that decision.
Well, I think in terms of understanding how these things work, inevitably Scottish Government would have, I think, a decisive say ultimately in terms of whether the opt-out was accepted, whether it was accepted that the exceptional circumstances were such to justify that. That is, unless, in relation to Rhoda Grant's proposition, you could have come up with sufficient definition in the bill. So if an opt-out could be sufficiently defined whereby the ground rules are clear, then you may have an automatic opt-out on the basis of certain kinds of evidence. But it's quite difficult, I think, to see at this point, even in terms of the responses that you described, Chairman, the exceptional circumstances, I think, which local authorities are describing, they're doing that in a fairly generalised way, and you know, I think we are short of examples to give you on that.
Okay. Right, I think we want to move on and address an issue you've touched on already, this question of the new economic duty that will apply to local authorities. I'll bring in Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd really appreciate to hear witness views on why the majority of local authorities responding to the government's consultation were opposed to the introduction of the new economic duty. And the table, the Better Regulation Bill, the analysis of consultation responses shows that 12 local authorities were against and only Edinburgh supported it. So I'd like to hear your views on why that might be the case.
I could start with a general proposition if you want, and I'm sure that others can fill in. I mean, generally, I suppose what we would say is the duty to promote economic growth does cut across local democratic accountability. There is an issue in respect of that. Councils are clearly able to make judgments in their own localities on a balance of interests in relation to the activity that they should pursue. So that's the first proposition. I think beyond that, there's a potential inconsistency between different duties that local authorities have to apply. So you've got community empowerment, the well-being of community benefit without clear definition of how the legislative requirements would interact. We've clearly got responsibilities like best value as well. How would it relate to that? Now, I think there has been an effort to mitigate the very generalised proposition which is behind the economic growth duty. It started, one has to say, simply as a bald economic growth duty. It's now moved somewhat to becoming sustainable economic growth. There's merit in that, one has to say, to create a situation in which you may have very transient economic growth trumping local social or environmental concerns would be a serious issue for us. There has been further attempt, I think, to mitigate the effects of the economic duty by saying specifically in the bill that it needs to be measured against other responsibilities that local authorities have. That's certainly a step in the right direction. Again, I think it goes back really to a question that's already been asked in terms of the national duty. Do we regard that as an ideal position? The answer to that is simply not. You know, I said earlier on that councils are absolutely under no illusion about the importance of sustainable economic growth. If anything, members are sometimes and this is maybe a risky observation, but are more preoccupied by that than they are by other issues. So actually, there does need to be balance in the system. There needs to be proportionality in decision making, and to create this kind of precept, which also you'll see is cropping up in relation to other legislative propositions or other guidance propositions like NPF 3 and SPP, is, we think, going down the wrong path. It needs to be balanced, and it needs to be an approach which recognises the full gamut of things the local authority decision makers need to take into account.
Others' views?
Yes, please. Mr. Galloway from Edinburgh, do you want to say?
Yes, I'd like to come in there. As the only authority that reported, I'm surprised that we're the only authority that reported in favour of this. I think anything that helps to promote economic development from an economic development service point of view is going to be a good thing. And in Edinburgh, we have a deliberate policy to try and make it easier to do business in Edinburgh. We've brought together our business support services to co-locate alongside some of our regulatory services, principally the business-facing ones. And that's enabled a new dialogue between business support and planning, licensing, environmental services, and even finance, non-domestic rates, which collectively seek to support the business customer, if you like. So broadly, this is in line with our strategy and our operations within Edinburgh, so we're broadly in support of it. I think the checks and balances would need to be there to ensure that, for example, in a planning application process, that the economic benefit argument was in balance with the other arguments, and this wouldn't lead to a sort of presumed consent type situation. So I know that colleagues in the planning department would be concerned about that, but I think the flavour of this bill is to try and make it easier to do business in Scotland and make it easier for businesses to understand and comply with regulations, and in turn make it easier for councils to apply those regulations. So in that respect, the economic focus on this is broadly welcomed.
Hear the other views too, if I may.
Thank you. I think from a legal point of view, there are concerns with the wording of this particular section. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the pre-consultation talked about introducing the principles of better regulation into legislation, and I think probably everyone would be quite happy with that. The consultation paper talked about a duty that local authorities would have to consider and report on the impact of the regulatory activities on business, where it's now crept into being a duty, except if it's inconsistent with the exercise of those functions. I think it's worth bearing in mind, though, that regulatory issues are not like policy decisions. Regulatory cases end up in court because they do cost money in licensing and planning. And I think this particular section will end up as a lawyer's charter being argued over. If I can give you maybe a couple of practical examples. Section 25 and 37 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1997 say that a planning decision has to be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. The new draft Scottish planning policy in April of this year proposes that economic benefit of the development will be material consideration. But of course there's the question of, in light of this section, is economic benefit a greater weight of material consideration? Is it an overriding one? It's fertile ground for lawyers, I think. I think if a question, say in licensing, came up, or in another regime, the courts would say, well, what is the purpose of the legislation? Because they need to determine that, to determine if the economic benefit power is inconsistent with it. And certainly in liquor licensing, in the Bright Crew case, the courts made a complete and total hash of trying to determine an underlying principle, in spite of the fact that actually that legislation had 5 underlying principles in it. The court said that the purpose there was the sale of alcohol. Even in that case, Could you say the sale of alcohol was inconsistent with economic growth when you've got on the one hand health arguments against granting premises and the other arguments that new premises will bring jobs? It just creates a complete and total mess which will take ages for the courts to sort out. I think if you're in any doubt, apply this test to the issue of bank deregulation 10 years ago. This would have resulted in huge deregulation. I think in my view, certainly, if this section had been about introducing the principle of better regulation, there would have been no dispute whatsoever. Those are well understood, the proportionate exercise regulation and the exercise well. But at the very least, this needs to be watered back to what was proposed in the consultation paper, which is that it's a balancing criteria, not an overriding one. Because regulation is often about protection of the public. It's not necessarily about economic growth. There has to be a balance.
From an environmental health point of view, also we're dealing with a lot of businesses with regard to the condition of their premises or food safety, health and safety, or the impact on neighbours and so on. So, we are not here to put any obstacles in a business's way. We don't want to be harming that business. So our approach in Aberdeenshire, and I'm sure most councils, is to work with businesses. We also work in partnership with the Food Standards Agency, Health and Safety Executive, to make sure that we're applying regulations consistently and fairly. We do have good partnerships with local businesses. We do try to promote businesses that meet certain standards, for example, Eat Safe Awards, which in a way can have a financial benefit to that business. But as we just said, it's difficult where our main role is to ensure compliance with regulations that are also set through legislation, and our purpose is really there to ensure compliance with legislation and that there's no adverse impact on the public. So I'm not sure how our role in environmental health ties in with this side of thing, but I'm sure there's other aspects within council services where that duty could apply. And your earlier point about why perhaps only one council supported the proposal. From my own sort of point of view, when a consultation response was put together, it may depend on who actually contributed to the responses, to be perfectly honest. So it's I think maybe take those comments or those responses with a pinch of salt, possibly. That's just my point of view on that.
I'd like to ask two more quick questions, if I may. Just going back to Mr. Fraser's comment. So what you're saying is if a developer applies for consent to build houses and is refused, is that they could object to the decision on the grounds that the development could lead to economic growth. If a council refuses permission to develop, there is a chance now that the developer can come back and say, actually, you have a duty to promote economic growth, and I'm going to challenge that.
Yes, I think that they could possibly hang their hat on that in court to say that the planning authority did not pay sufficient regard to the duty to ensure economic growth, that the duty to ensure economic growth should have been given more weight as a material consideration than, for example, environmental impact, than the local plan. It just becomes terribly muddy, really. I think this duty will, given that it's duty in a regulatory area, which does end up in court, I think it will take a few years in court to finally find where it's at.
More question, if I may, Convener. Last week we heard from Scottish Natural Heritage, amongst others, and our convener asked what difference, if any, would the new economic duty make to the current organisation and delivery of their services, and they said, I do not think it will make any difference, given that we're already working towards the National Performance Framework, which it sits in. Do you feel that non-legislative approaches are currently working, that with single outcome agreements and so on, this is happening anyway? That certainly seems to be the thrust of what I've heard from some of the panel this morning.
Yes, is the answer to that. I think we've obviously been through an evolutionary process in relation to single outcome agreements and community planning. So I think we're starting a new chapter in relation to these things. Clearly in the past there was a duty on local authorities by consequence of statute in relation to community planning. That duty, by consequence of the bill, looks like it will be extended to other public sector partners. I think that's certainly very welcomed by local authorities, because it then obliges all stakeholders to bring their resources and their talents to the table to deal with issues which are important in localities. So as a direction of travel, that seems to us to be entirely appropriate. And in some ways, this kind of approach, or the approach hinted at in terms of the imposition of specific duties, runs counter to that approach. The Scottish Government, rightly in my view, is very keen on the placemaking agenda. That is a fundamental proposition behind community planning and single outcome agreements. That is the right direction of travel as far as we're concerned. This intrudes upon that and infringes, I think, what we're seeking to do there.
Yeah, I think I can perhaps also pick up on that. It's worth a quote from the March 2013 report from Audit Scotland on community planning in Scotland, and that's got some quite trenchant comments. It said, Scottish Government is currently involved in a wide-ranging programme of public sector reform. This includes reviewing community planning, integrated health and social care, national police and fire, college regionalisation and community empowerment. Several of these developments, such as health and social care integration and the review of community care planning, share a common focus on partnerships, place and integrating services. Others still, such as police and fire reform, have a significant national dimension. Others, such as college regionalisation, have a regional focus. This complex network of reforms may present challenges in establishing local community planning arrangements that are the foundation within which wider reform initiatives will happen in line with the expectations of the Statement of Ambition. Overall, Scottish Government public service developments do not appear to be well joined up when viewed from a local perspective. And I think that's the criticism of sections 1 to 4 of this Act. It's not well joined up with other public sector reform, particularly viewed from a local perspective.
Marco Biaggi?
No, I think my question's been covered quite well.
Okay, just maybe before we leave this issue of economic benefit, can I just ask a couple of questions just for clarity? Councillor Cook, in the written submission from COSLA, where you address the question of the economic duty, it's a little unclear from that exactly what your position is. Maybe you can just be clear. Does COSLA support this being in the bill or not?
I'm trying to ride two horses, as you found earlier, really, aren't I? The ideal would be, I didn't quite hear that, the ideal would be that it isn't in the bill, I think. I think the evidence you've heard today is that we would prefer not to have the complication and the potential duplication and confusion which flows from trying to adduce additional duties into legislation like this. And yet, the position that we've resolved upon is there has been an effort on the part of Scottish Government to reach a compromise and mitigate some of the effects of that. So we've moved to a much better position. Is it the ideal position? The answer to that would be not. It's certainly a much better position.
That's helpful just to get that clarity. Final question on this. Can you, Councillor Cook, or anybody else tell me, what does sustainable economic growth mean?
Sustainable that is a very good question. It is undefined, and there are one or two propositions in the bill as yet undefined, so that is an issue.
Anybody else want to volunteer a definition?
I think that's the exact point, that it would be very helpful to have a definition of it before the courts make it.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, we need to move on and look at the Code of Practice on regulatory functions. Check Brody.
Morning. Again, sections 5 and 6 of the bill cover the Code of Practice and the Code of Practice procedure. And the section allows Scottish ministers to issue a Code of Practice in the relation of the exercise of the regulatory functions to specified regulators. I wonder if local authorities in COSLA have any concerns relating to that code of practice?
I think probably it broadly it's okay. The same issue arises in relation to Section 6, subsection 3B, where you'll see the economic duty repeated in effect. So I think the concerns that we've articulated previously arise in relation to this also.
I think we can have a longer debate and ensure that everyone understands sustainable economic growth in terms of employment and productivity, but we'll leave that for the moment. Do you, looking at detail, apart from that, is there any other consideration that gives you concern in terms of getting guidance from ministers in the application of the code?
I think subject to the collaborative approach, the partnership approach outlined in the Memorandum of Understanding, the answer to that would be no.
Okay.
Okay. Can I ask about Section 7 of the bill, which is the power on Scottish ministers to modify the list of regulators or regulatory functions? Do you have any concerns about that?
I think the difficulty with these is they're all generalised propositions in terms of things that we can't yet see. So there is a lingering anxiety in relation to them, in that things which we don't have sight of at the present time could be modified, particularly if that was not mitigated through the Memorandum of Understanding. And I think it remains a key proposition for us that any effort to change something as yet unseen would now be a matter of partnership discussion, rather than being a matter simply of a minister individually coming to a view. That has to be a better position, having that kind of discussion. But there are certainly lingering issues, I think, in terms of the generalised nature of some of these propositions. And it goes back to something that I think we've put delicately so far, but is just the anxiety about the generalised nature of the power and how it would be better to have it relating to discrete items which are visible and based on evidence.
Fraser?
Yes, just 2 points really. On the list of bodies included, there's slight doubt as to whether licensing boards are in there. They're not listed, but it might be worth checking whether the intention was to include them. And the other point was about this issue of generalised powers. Really, the only restriction on the powers in Section 1 is contained in Section 2.3 of the Act, which I have to say I don't understand. I find it very difficult to understand, and it may be something the committee wants to have a closer look at some point.
Okay, thank you. Another area we've mentioned briefly in passing is planning fees, which I know is an area of concern to Councillor. A couple of members want to bring in questions on that. I'll start with Margaret McDougall.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. I perhaps should say in the first instance that I do know Andrew Fraser from a previous life as a councillor in North Ayrshire when he was an officer there. Just on planning, that the bill is talking about sanctions that would be imposed on local authorities if they didn't meet certain criteria and certain timescales. Could you perhaps give a view on that?
Yeah, there's no question. We have serious concerns about that. Some of those concerns are matters of principle and others are matters of practicality. In terms of the principle hints at things I think we've already talked about, really, which is it certainly smacks of high-handed arbitrariness, which I think is undesirable. It infringes local accountability, and actually it's inconsistent with the chief objective of the bill, which is consistency. So I think there are a number of issues of principle in there. In terms of practicality, there is as yet no definition around many things which would be important in terms of clarifying the direction of travel on this. So there's no clarity in relation to what is good or bad performance. There is no reference actually to the question of full cost recovery and the fact that the planning services are currently heavily subsidised by the taxpayer in other ways. So that means less resources are available for other services. And let's be quite frank, planning authorities are not responsible for all of the delays in the planning system. It's typical for the time it takes to resolve a planning issue to be doubled or even tripled by the requirement for Section 75 legal agreements. So that is a major component, and you'll have seen the evidence in relation to that. There's no indication of the length of time over which the penalty would apply. And beyond that, even if we were to accept that there should be some kind of penalty, it's not clear what would be penalised. There seems to be an implication that the thing that would be assessed would be timescale, the speed of processing applications. I'm sorry, that would be utterly misconceived. In our view, the important thing is quality decision making. Timescales are certainly important. I don't think anyone would pretend otherwise, but actually quality decision making is much more important in many ways, and we need to also be mindful of the outputs from planning decision making at the present time. The simple fact is that 93% of planning applications are approved. Now, the reason that they are approved is because of the level of industry that goes into making those applications acceptable. How is that done? That is often done through constant conversation and dialogue between the applicant and the planning authority, which gets an application which may have had issues into shape whereby it can be accepted and approved. So that may take more time. But does it produce an altogether more satisfactory result? I don't think there's really any issue about that. It does. And the overall approach, I think, to a planning penalty clause is just misconceived. There is a high-level group which is populated by the COSLA spokesperson, Stephen Hagan, and the Minister to look at some of the issues in relation to planning performance. I think it's right that they look at some of these issues, but we are still some distance apart in relation to the question of the penalty clause. And I think we'd be keen to see that change and a much more, again, to use the word, proportionate and balanced approach in relation to this.
That's a no then to the sanctions.
Yes, I think you could safely say that.
Yes, but
it's the most unambiguous I've been today.
Right. So you mentioned that COSLA is working with the Scottish Government. They've got some sort of group where they're looking at how they monitor performance of planning applications.
Yes, that is right.
Is that the only way that they're being monitored at the moment? I mean, how do local authorities monitor their performance, and how do they deal with a poor performing planning authority?
How do you deal with it? Well, I mean, it obviously local authorities collect data on this all the time. So I can look up on a regular basis what the planning performance is in my council. Indeed, I think you've probably got some evidence which reflects the timelines for these things. So it's a matter of routine expectation that I can look up and see how we're performing. We then make judgments about the level of investment in the department. All departments across the country, I think without exception, are heavily subsidised. The cost recovery, I think I can give you figures for this, back in 2004, 2005, councils used to recover 81% of their costs in planning from the charging regime which they applied. In 2010-11, that had reduced to 56%. So, in short, the other 44% of the provision that we have to provide is effectively subsidised by other resources, and that means that other areas of activity consequently go light. It's worth also saying that in terms of who has the interest in ensuring that the planning authority performs well, actually, I've got an interest in that in my local authority. The person who is directly accountable in terms of whether Scottish Borders Council performs well as a planning authority is me, together with my 33 colleagues on Scottish Borders Council. City of Edinburgh, that's true. In every other council across the land, that is true. The people who are vested with this responsibility are democratically accountable for it.
And Audit Scotland will comment on that as well, I presume, on the performance of the council as a whole. Yeah.
Well, they do. I mean, they obviously they audit us regularly, and you know, planning performance can and regularly is a feature of that.
Yeah. So, do you think the heads of Planning Scotland planning performance framework is an appropriate mechanism for assessing performance of planners?
It's. I mean, there is an aspiration across the country to improve performance. I don't think there's any ambiguity about that. The question is how you do that, though, and you do it by looking at the evidence again and, frankly, investing in improved performance. I mean, I just, you know, there's an argument here as well, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Just to give you an interesting comparison, the Energy Consents Unit, which obviously is an arm of Scottish Government, in August 2012, they said they weren't doing too badly in terms of their performance. They had a 9-month target for processing applications, and they were averaging 26 months. The performance of local authorities, as you'll see from the evidence you've got, is far superior to that.
Mm-hmm. So, to what extent the type and complexity of planning applications should be taken into consideration when evaluating whether a planning authority has performed satisfactorily or not? You know, if this legislation was looking at that and how they monitor that, and you know, it's how to. You're saying you're not in favour of sanctions, but what could they use instead then, and how should they measure that?
An approach which is favoured by Scottish Government and certainly is an approach worth looking at is the processing agreement model, whereby there is essentially an agreement between developers and the planning authority with regard to the processing of that application. Now, my understanding is that, for example, the Amazon development in Fife was a product of that system. So I don't want to put words into the mouths of Amazon, but my expectation would be that what they would say is what they wanted was quality decision making, even if it took slightly longer, 7 months in that case, rather than trying to thrash something through in 3 months and getting to a place where you don't get the result which people aspire to, and actually you get the wrong result. And that can sometimes, I think, be the consequence of trying to set arbitrary timelines.
Any of the other panel members have any views on that?
Yes, from an Aberdeenshire Council point of view, I'm from environmental health, not from planning, but I know obviously within Aberdeenshire we've a very high number of wind turbine applications, and you know, if you were to measure, well, we do measure performance in terms of number of applications processed within 2 months, and it's the wind turbines aspect that is harming that figure, and a lot of that is down to the work that our department's involved in terms of noise, and that's, as Councillor Cook mentioned, it's not always down to the fault of the service or the council. Some of the information that comes in from developers and applicants is less than desirable. So there's a multitude of reasons for the time taken, and it's far better to get an application properly assessed, take on board objectors' views as well, rather than rushing through. I think there's a lot of pressure put on us at the moment to process applications within a short time scale, almost just to make the figure look good. And I think that's totally wrong. So there has to be a framework by which we can properly measure the time taken by a council or a service. So that it's, you know, you can't just look at it in terms of the time taken.
Can I just add something to that? There is the question of where fault would lie. So, for example, if you have a significant planning application which is going through the process, you then have a Section 75 legal agreement around that, as a result of which you have a developer contribution which is payable. It is sometimes the case that the unwillingness of the developer to meet the developer contribution then completely thwarts the process. Now, as things currently look, it almost looks as though the local authority would be held accountable for that. Clearly, that just wouldn't be appropriate at all, because that would not be where the fault lay. And that is, I think, as Dave Cooper is saying, you know, not infrequently the position.
Anyone else?
Fraser.
This is slightly coming in at a tangent. I do wonder the extent to which the increases in fees would actually result in new money to the local authority, and it might be worth the committee checking that there would be no reduction in the GAE allocation from government to local authorities to reflect the increased fees. If that was the case, local government planning wouldn't be getting any more money, government would be saving and business would be losing. I'm sure that won't be the case, but it might be worth checking. I suppose my position on this is that it does, on a common sense point of view, seem counterproductive that you're poorly performing planning authorities, you take money away from them. Yeah. They can only get worse.
Yeah.
Okay, still on planning, Mike Mackenzie wants to come in.
Thank you, Convener. And I'm sure Councillor Cook will be delighted to know that I absolutely agree with him about the quality of decision making being paramount. But I'm struck that since the 1947 Planning Act, pretty much everything we built before that is listed or it's protected in the form of conservation areas. And we all agree, I think that's terrific. I just wonder if there's all that much that the planning system has delivered in terms of quality that we'll be listing for the listed buildings of tomorrow and the conservation areas of tomorrow.
I'm not sure that question is desperately relevant to this bill, to be honest.
Well, given that an important outcome of the planning system, and I absolutely agree, Councillor Cook's mentioned this, the quality of what it delivers. Do you agree with me that the quality of what the planning system's been delivering is really something we can be proud of?
I just think it's not possible really for me to answer that question. I'm not sure how relevant it is to your deliberations.
Okay, I'll move on then, right? It was you that raised the quality of decision making, but I'll move on. Do you feel that it's correct?
If you want. I mean, you can only deal with the applications before you. So if you get a dud application, it's a dud application. That is a simple reality. If you get a quality application, you've got a quality application and you can deal with it appropriately. That's the reality.
I think the point is there's a difference between the quality of the application and the quality of the process and the quality of what's actually built at the end of the day. And this bill won't have any impact, I suspect, on what's actually built at the end of the day.
Yeah, that is correct.
Sorry, Mr Mackenzie.
Thank you, Convener. Would you agree with me, Councillor Cook, that the planning system delivers a public good in terms of safeguarding the quality of the environment, perhaps improving it, safeguarding the quality of the built environment and perhaps improving it?
Indeed, I would agree with you, yes.
And is it therefore necessarily correct then that an applicant, somebody who's building an extension to his house, for instance, should fully fund this planning system?
The issue actually is not in relation to applications at that level. The issue, I think you'll see in the annex, which is attached to the evidence, is in relation to significant applications. That's where the real deficit is. So in terms of full cost recovery, I think our anxiety is less at the lower end of the scale in terms of application size. It's really the big applications that we're talking about. Frankly, a conservative application is pretty much likely to be most of the cost of that process being recovered through the fee. That is clearly not true in relation to, a 1,226 metre turbine application or something of that nature. There's quite a big discrepancy there. And I think what we're keen to see, this is a matter being discussed through the high-level group at the present time, is how we take that forward and we get to a point where there is a full cost recovery and a much more appropriate funding level. Audit Scotland themselves have said that the present funding position of planning departments is unsustainable.
Given the economic circumstances in which we find ourselves, the very difficult economic circumstances, and reports in the news today that house building, for instance, is at its lowest level ever since the Great Depression. And I'll hasten to add that that includes private sector. In fact, the largest fall-off is private sector. Do you really feel it's realistic for the house building sector, for instance, in larger applications to fully fund the planning system?
In respect of major applications, you find that actually planning fees are a tiny proportion of what developers are looking at in terms of their overall cost envelope. I would be astonished if I mean, you're given an example in relation to a wind farm in the annex, but the difference in fee in respect of that particular example would be an increase of £30,000 for that developer. Now, these are relatively small-scale increases relative to the scale of large-scale developments that we're talking about. And the problem with the fall-off in house building, frankly, is nothing to do with the planning system. It's to do with the economic climate. And I think we need to recognise that reality.
Well, I think I might dispute that with you, but in terms of the principle, though, given that a public good is delivered by the planning system, you still feel that it should be paid for by developers?
Well, do you want a properly funded system which produces quality results or not?
The issue is somebody has to pay. It's either the general taxpayer who's nothing to do with the developer who's paying, or alternatively it's the developer, and that's a decision essentially for government as to who it wants to pay.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, Convener, you'll be pleased to note. In the causal evidence, you'd stated that there have been improvements in planning performance. For instance, an increase in determining applications within the statutory 2-month period from 45.4% to 50.4%. Now that obligation, that statutory obligation to determine applications within 2 months has been about for as long as I can remember, certainly for a very long time. It predates this Parliament, and yet we're only at a level, and we seem to be boasting somewhat, or Councillor do, about increasing it to 50.4%. I regard that as a very poor result, don't you?
Well, yeah, clearly there is improvement in that result. I mean, what you're dealing with, composed within that figure, are historic legacy applications as well. They certainly impact the figures. Again, it goes back to the proposition which Andrew has just laid out for you. If you want a fully effective system, you want it to produce quality results in the time frame that you want, you need a properly funded system. That isn't the position at the present time. If anything, actually, local government has done well to improve performance in a context where funding is under even greater pressure. And this is also in a context where actually the number of wind farm applications that we're dealing with have been enormous. So there's a very distinct pressure on planning departments from that. And yet the performance has improved. So in that regard, that's not a bad result.
This runs counter to the principles that we were talking about earlier on, that local authorities have their budget. It's a local choice about how they spend that budget, what they believe to be important. Given that somebody's got to pay for this public good and that local councils want to retain local decision-making powers, surely local councils should be paying for this, for the planning system that delivers a public good.
Sorry, is that an entirely serious question? Where do you think most of our money comes from? 85% of our funding comes direct from from central government. So, planning departments and other things, we need to make judgments about all of the services that we fund. We try and do that in the most appropriate way, taking into consideration all of the local circumstances. We've got pressures in social work, we've got burdens in education, we've got, yeah.
And just finally, you regard 50.4% as a good result?
Well, I mean, you're asking me a closed question, which, to be honest,
Answer would do.
Well, I think it's a fairly pointless question. It's clearly an improved result in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you.
Briefly, Chip Roddy.
A brief one, and I represent the south of Scotland, of course, and Berwick-upon-Tweed is part of that. When you get into discussions about wind farms, East Berwick-upon-Tweed,
Ayrshire.
Berwick, yeah.
Anyway, well, actually, I might agree with you that Berwick-upon-Tweed perhaps would be better off in Scotland, but that's another issue.
Well, I agree with that. The point Mr. Fraser made, and in fact, Councillor make it in their submission, is that poorly planning authorities, if you take money away from them, then that will only make them worse. Based on my business experience, it wasn't always essentially additional funding that was needed. So what other efforts would you take, other than funding, to improve poorly planning authorities. And I've got figures, as I say, across each of the councils in the south of Scotland in terms of planning performance. And with regard to wind farms, the biggest problem is we've seen too many single wind farms as opposed to the development of proper wind farms. Can you tell me what other action would you take, other than funding, to address the issue of poorly planning authorities?
I mean, there's clearly management action as well, and the framework which was mentioned before. There is an aspiration to improve performance. Also, the high-level group, which I've described earlier, where we've got Councillor and government meeting about improving performance, I expect there to be products from that which are geared towards seeing how we can significantly improve performance. But at the heart of it, there's no question, there is a funding deficit. That is an issue in terms of running the service.
I think there has been a lot of good work done over the previous years by government and local authorities, looking at the whole system. For example, dropping some of the stuff into the state where it's permitted development, some of the lower level stuff, to clear that out of the system. The idea that many of the appeals are handled in-house within the local authority rather than all going up to Scottish Enquirer reporters. I think you need to look at the system as a whole to see what can come out of planning control and the processing of it, rather than just looking at the timescales and not tweaking the system.
Yeah, just to add to that, obviously what we've done in my local authority is we've quite significantly changed the level of delegated decision making. So applications which might hitherto have gone to members for consideration, with all the delay in the system that necessarily entails with meeting cycles and various other things, those are now processed by officers, and actually that led to quite a significant increase in performance as a result of that. So there are things that you can do like that which do make a difference.
The process as a consequence of changing the regulations and improving the efficiency, not in planning, but also bodies that impact that. Do you not believe that would help?
Yes, but that's been a matter of judgment that we've made about how the system operates, and obviously we've had to weigh up different considerations in making that judgment. We've had to weigh up the question of how objectors play into that system, perhaps not having their day in court, as it were, with items going to full planning committee. So we've created mechanisms within the system which deal with that. But by and large, most applications can now be processed on the basis that they're dealt with under delegation.
And I appreciate that, and I think that's effective. But do you not agree that by looking at the rules and regulations of bodies, whether it's CEPA or what have you, and improving the understanding and the communication and getting some sort of consistency, do you not believe that will improve the efficiency of planning, for example, and thereby achieve sustainable economic growth?
Well, I mean, obviously you're trying to push me in the direction of saying that everything in the bill is hunky-dory.
No, I'm not trying to push you in any direction.
I mean, clearly there are, as I think we've said consistently throughout this discussion, there are circumstances where discussion with Scottish Government about things which could be set nationally to give proper impetus and direction is appropriate. But you need to look at the discrete area to work out the appropriateness of it. And that remains true at the end of this discussion as it was at the start, I think.
Okay. We need to move on from planning. We've got a couple of other areas we need to cover. Section 42 deals with street traders' licences. Dennis Robertson has a question.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'll probably direct my question to Mr. Cooper, given your background, Mr. Cooper, in environmental health. And perhaps we're moving on to maybe a less complex and controversial issue. But there's a proposal within the bill to have a single licence approach to the street traders, and especially maybe mobile food operators. What's your view on that?
The Aberdeenshire Council would support that proposal, but at the same time we do have concerns about Council's ability to carry out inspections of those businesses while they're operating. When the certificate of compliance is when the van is assessed for the certificate, it's usually assessed either at council premises or at the base, not when it's operating. You only see how well a business is operating and how safely it's operating when it's actually operating and open to the public. So if something can be built into the legislation that still allows authorities in which the business is actually operating carry out inspections, then we would be happy with that. Clearly, there's a need for national standards in this area before it would be acceptable to local authorities. But the principle is accepted, but say concerns about the ability of councils to carry out inspections.
It's the first time this morning we've heard that there's a need for national standards. Well, there could be. Yeah, well, I think in terms of other aspects of food safety, councils are working very closely with the Food Standards Agency with regard to implementing what is termed the cross-contamination strategy, where we're targeting certain businesses, certain food businesses, and that's been shown to work very well.
Actually, I don't think there's any surprise in that response there. I think that it conforms exactly to what we've been saying, is when you look at a particular area, it may be that there is a need for national guidance and national standards, and it's appropriate then to have a discussion with Scottish Government and create something that's fit for purpose in that particular area. That's entirely consistent with our evidence from top to bottom.
Alison Johnson and myself had a meeting with the Environmental Health Officer, and one of the concerns that was sort of raised was there could be a dilution of maybe standards. I think it was suggested that Edinburgh, Aberdeen and maybe Aberdeenshire, Glasgow have very high standards and maybe some authorities less so. What would you be looking at in terms of the national standard?
We build upon the guidance we've got in terms of the cross-contamination strategy, in terms of standards to be expected in that particular business. I know in the consultation paper there was reference to inconsistencies between local authorities and the requirements for particular facilities to be provided in advance. So I think it's got to be clear in terms of food safety, health and safety, gas safety, etc. And but even then, there still has to be scope for a bit of flexibility, because not every business operates in the same way or is structured in the same way. So there has to be some degree of flexibility, but the main issues should be covered, we believe anyway, with national standards.
Have you got any specific guidance that you would like to see there?
Personally not, no. But if you are seeking specific comments, make sure our food specialists can pull something together.
I think that would be helpful to get some sort of specific guidance in terms of examples of maybe areas that you have maybe of some concern, and certainly what you would like to see there as a final outcome, to be perfectly honest. Mr. Fraser or Mr. Cook, any comments?
This isn't an area of expertise for me. Perhaps Andrew has something to add.
I suppose the only comment is a generic one, that the problem in this particular area arose because of deficiencies, inconsistencies in the drafting of the legislation. Different local authorities thought they were bound to do different things. And in my view, giving ministers the power to make broad sweeping regulations without parliamentary scrutiny is more likely to produce further bad legislation than good legislation.
No, I think at the moment you would probably agree that there is some degree of inconsistency, and am I right in thinking that you do welcome this approach in terms of having this one particular licence issued by a local authority, so people can actually be more mobile and don't have to apply for additional licences moving into different authorities?
My understanding is it's the certificate of compliance is the only aspect this touches on. The operator would still have to apply for a licence to operate in each council area.
And that would be appropriate, because the circumstances where they may choose to operate would be a matter of local consideration.
But certainly, in terms of the national standard I mentioned, that doesn't necessarily need this particular legislation to bring that in. I think local authorities have been praised by the Food Standards Agency for the way in which they work in partnership with each other and with the agency, and that's an avenue I think that these national standards can come through.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end of our time. You'll be pleased to hear one more area of questioning I just want to bring in before we close, and this relates to matters which are not in the bill. We've talked a lot about what was in the bill. two specific items not in the bill, but where there's been an indication already there might be stage 2 amendments to introduce them. The first is this concept of primary authority partnerships, which I'm sure you're aware have existed in England and Wales since 2009, but not yet in Scotland. And Fergus Ewing has indicated his intention to bring in a stage 2 amendment to adopt primary authority partnerships here. Is that something you would support? Would Councillor support that? Councillor Cook?
I think it's something that could be a matter of discussion. Clearly, the object of all local authorities is to improve performance. Following the best practice of a leader in a particular area of activity is something I think that could be considered. But
You're being non-committal.
Yes, I am being non-committal. And I'm going to continue to be non-committal on that. I certainly think it's something we can look at.
Something you would look at, but you haven't got a firm view at the moment.
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Fraser?
I think it would have been better if this was in the consultation paper and in the bill to start with, and we could see what was intended. In principle, this can be a good idea, depending on the regulatory system involved. It's used in building standards. It can be a good idea, but it needs work.
Okay. And secondly, the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, indicated in a letter to our sister committee on rural affairs and climate change that the government might bring forward a stage 2 amendment on fixed penalty notices for litter. And this would extend the powers of public bodies other than local authorities to issue fixed penalty notices for litter. Is that something Councillor has a view on?
It's not something, certainly, which forms part of my brief. I mean, I can give you a personal view on it, but I don't imagine that's what you're looking for, really.
Not really.
So I don't have a Councillor position to give you on that.
Okay. I mean, it would be helpful to the committee in anticipation of these amendments coming forward at stage 2, if you're able to come back to us at some point on both
Very
these
happy
issues.
to do that.
Yeah. Mr. Fraser, yes?
There is a general point which some of the efficiencies in regulatory regimes are about having the one inspector, for example, do a number of inspections, whether it's in behalf of planning, building standards, environmental health and so on, using mobile technology. And the idea, I suppose, of different agencies, different officers being able to serve litter notices feeds into that. So in principle, it's probably to have the power is no bad thing.
Although, interestingly, in our authority, officers of all different types of descriptions can issue notices at the present time, so that's an adjustment that we have made.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. If nobody else wants to come in with any further questions, I think we can draw the session to a close. So can I thank you, Councillor Cook, Mr. Fraser, Mr. Galloway, Mr. Cooper, for your time coming along this morning. It's been very helpful. There are one or two areas I think you said you would come back to us with some more information. If you could do that, that would be helpful to us too. And with that, I think we'll have a short suspension.